The commissioner, NBA Commissioner Adam Silver is here with us. Thank you so much for taking the time out to join us. The Celtics back in the NBA playoffs for the first time since 2010. And then you got Scal here, who's on that championship team back in 2008. Just what does it do for the league when you have the Celtics back on that stage of the NBA Finals?
Well, I think for both of these franchises, I mean, they're two of the original 11 franchises in the league. Celtics, you tied for the most championships in league history, going for the record. The Warriors won the first ever NBA championship, so two storied franchises. So for both the Celtics and Warriors, I think not just for obviously the Boston community and the Bay Area here, but truly global followings for both these teams. So it's fantastic for the league. And
the league has kind of been taken over by super teams. I can't help but to think about LeBron James and him taking his talents to South Beach years ago. And now you have two teams in the NBA Finals that have really drafted players and built their teams around guys that they've developed. You know, how much is the league maybe shifting from that super team to now having homegrown teams at these stages?
It's so interesting you ask that because, of course, these are super teams by definition.
Correct.
You know, because they're here. But I know the way you mean it. They're created in different ways. The core comes through the draft. I mean, they still take advantage of trades and free agency. But I don't think there's any doubt that not only do fans in those markets, but fans everywhere think it's a fairer way. I don't know how else to say it, you know, and I think to reward teams that have great scouting, you know, great professionals in executive positions, doing the drafting, building teams, I don't know what to say it the old-fashioned way.
Yeah.
I just think it leads to more fan support, and I think it's something that we pay a lot of attention to.
One thing I want to talk about from last year to this year, it seems like the physicality of the game has gone up, and I think the improvement of the game has gone up. What is the process from going from last year to this year and changing the rules and allowing more physicality to get to this great game that we had all season?
Great point. The process, it really begins with a meeting we have with all the general managers around the league. Then it goes to a competition committee and ultimately to the board of governors who oversee the entire league. I think there was a sense that we'd gotten out of balance a bit, that offenses were being favored, players who had found crafty ways, called non-basketball moves. I mean, good for them. I mean, that's what happens when you have some of the greatest athletes in the world. They look at a set of rules and they figure out edges. And I think there was a sense then that we had to pull back a little bit, let defenses be great, you know, not end up calling fouls where, even for me sitting in the stands, most people would say, even if they just casually played basketball, the reaction was, come on, you know, that's not a foul you should be calling. That's not a basketball move. That's contrived to try to create a foul. And so I think we're in a better spot. I mean, one thing I know from just the research we look at too, fans like defense more than they get credit for. They obviously, we don't want it to get out of hand. We don't want it to become overly physical where sort of brute strength is favored. But on the other hand, you want guys to play hard defense, and I think we found a much better balance this year.
Yeah, speaking of balance, like where you've mentioned a lot of times about load management, players sitting out, all that stuff. Are there ways to head the direction of correcting that?
I'm hoping there are. We're about to go into another collective bargaining cycle with the players, and I think we got to look at everything from maybe incentivizing players for certain awards to ensure that they've played a certain number of games to be eligible. I think a lot of it comes down to proper maybe financial incentives too, in terms of number of games played, number of minutes played. I think everyone wants to see the best players on the floor, but back to that concept about balance, I think, you know, we all know from the very old days in the league, there are plenty of examples where guys played through injuries and they probably shouldn't have.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think finding that balance where moving away from necessarily a load management concept, of course, putting guys in a position where they can take care of their bodies, getting rest when absolutely needed, but still creating the right incentives to get the best players on the floor. That's what the fans care about.
Let me ask you, like if you were a kid and you went to a game and you wanted to see the Brooklyn Nets and Kevin Durant checks in the second half and plays 18 minutes in the second half, would you be upset if you saw that and say like, man, I didn't get to see him for 36?
I wouldn't be.
No.
And I think in the so-called old days, even so, I'm in my 30th year in the league. I mean, just take Michael Jordan, for example. In those days, Michael knew everywhere he went, there was a group of fans who were there primarily to see him, and it may be the only opportunity they'd ever have in their lives maybe to see him. And so he, even if he were a bit banged up or the view was he needed rest, he would start the game, play a certain number of minutes. Maybe he'd sit for the whole second quarter. He'd start the third quarter, maybe sit more minutes. And it was a different time, and I think part of it, having been the league at the time, and it says a lot about Michael Jordan, it wasn't just what his Phil Jackson or Jerry Krause or somebody was telling him. It was like he felt that obligation.
Yeah.
And in fairness to today's players, I mean, there are many cases, and I'm sure you're having these conversations with players too, where it's often the teams, it's a program they're looking at on load management, analytics. So again, there's not simple answers. I don't think that the league office should be in the position of dictating that you have to play this many games or minutes. But I do think we can't lose sight of the fact that we're doing this ultimately for the fans. We are a business. People are paying enormous amount of money to see these games in person, watch them on television too. And again, just as we were talking about defense earlier, it calls for a bit of a recalibration.
And you mentioned load management, and there are discussions out there right now about whether or not the season should be shortened. You have some people on one side who say no, like you're an elite athlete, you play those games, you can go through the season. And you have some people who are like, okay, maybe that's something that the league needs to consider. What are your thoughts on either shortening the season or keeping it the way it is?
Not surprisingly, I'm in the middle. So I think that the season is roughly the right overall footprint right now, beginning called mid-October, ending in mid-June. I think potentially we could cut a few games back and add some other competition throughout the year, possibly an in-season tournament to create more fan interest. It's interesting. People quickly forgot that we reduced the number of games last year in the regular season because of COVID issues from 82 to 72. It made almost no difference in terms of injuries. It wasn't as if we eliminated load management that teams went into and say, all right, 72 games this year instead of 82, we won't rest players. So that was a valuable lesson because, look, it's a business too. If you reduce from 82 to 72 games, it's a big economic impact, not just for the league, but for the players too. It's a revenue sharing system. They get half the money. So they're interested in playing a full complement of games. And I've, like when we've talked about this, I hear from some of the old timers say like, don't coddle the players. I think this is trying to find the right balance. I don't think we're way off in terms of mid-October to mid-June. I do think we could find ways to enhance competition throughout the year.
Speaking of competition throughout the playoffs, a lot of blowouts. Like, what's your theory on that?
I don't really have one. I'm told by folks in the league office that it's not that aberrational.
Okay.
That they seem to all come in the last round, so it made it seem like we were having more blowouts than usual. But I don't really. It's something we'll look at when the season's over. We'll go back and we'll look over everything. But it's also, even to the extent, it is a little bit, off the charts in terms of the last few years. I think before you start changing rules and things, you got to make sure there's a pattern over a few years. But I don't think it's an issue that requires our attention yet.
And then with the Celtics back in the NBA Finals, Boston's a great city. When could we see All-Star be in Boston?
Ooh, tough one.
Well, I don't know if you knew this, but the first 2 NBA All-Star games ever, which were in the early 50s, were played in Boston.
Oh, wow.
So we got to get back there. And, for Wick and Steve and ownership there, I know that's something that they care about.
Yeah.
I can say as a fan, as the commissioner, we love to get around the league, different markets. Boston is one of those great sports towns. Yeah. I know that people would love to have it there. So they are focused on it. I know we'd love to get back there for all.
And I'll send you the invite to the house party when you get it done.
All right.
Thanks so much, Adam, for coming to join us.